Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Greatest Games podcast on the Blizzard. My name is Marcus Speller. With me is Jonathan Wilson, and today we welcome back to the podcast John Brewin, football writer and contributor for The Guardian. Good to have you back, John.
Well, glad to be back, Marcus. I hope you're well.
Very well. On today's pod, we go back to the FA Cup final from 1990 that ended Crystal Palace 3, Manchester United 3, with Manchester United winning the replay 1-0, of course. John, why have you chosen this match?
Well, I was there. That's a good start. It's the first FA Cup final I attended. It's obviously a key moment in the Alex Ferguson and Manchester United story. And also, just thinking back over this game, it's a reminder of just how different things were to attend football at that time. I can maybe share a few personal memories of being at a game in which it was bedlam, quite frankly. This game was bedlam, and coming in and out of the stadium was bedlam, and a reflection on how things are the same, but they're very different, if you see what I mean, about attending matches. Obviously, we're at a point where people are returning to matches now. I personally watched this game through the fence at Wembley, which was still there.
Right, okay.
Because I was in the cheap seats at the bottom. I was sat with my mum. My mum took me along to this game. I was only 13 years old. And that's the last game she ever attended. Now, my mum likes football. Used to go to Old Trafford in the 60s and early 70s. But she has never wanted to go back to football after that game. Now, I don't know if it was that it was a particularly poor game, but I think some of the antics of those around and the complete chaotic nature of attending matches at that time. I mean, we're in a post-Hillsborough world at that point. That had happened a year before, but I don't think my mum has ever got over the sight of fat neck blokes in paisley shirts. It was 1990. Remember, this was the time of Manchester. Deciding that they would use the Wembley Terrace, as it was. The seats had just been bolted on, as a latrine. So it was. My mum's not the most delicate of people, but it was a certain point where she thought he's old enough to go to the games on his own now, and I will leave him there. And my dad couldn't attend for whatever reason, and But thinking about the game as well. Also, this is a game in which the anxiety of Manchester United to win this game is something that I still remember 31 years later, which is the utter blind panic that Manchester United fans went through that day. Now, of course, the key figure at this point is Jim Leighton, the goalkeeper, who had an absolute nightmare. But it was also at the point of that this mattered so much to Manchester United to get this win, and it mattered so much to Alex Ferguson, and that what happened in the aftermath of this game, of course, with the dropping of Jim Leighton for the replay, which Manchester United won. I think we all knew, even at that time, that Alex Ferguson was a ruthless man, but this was probably, to this day, his most ruthless piece of team selection, of cutting someone dead to suit his own needs. We saw that many times over the next, what would it be? 23 years as Manchester United manager. But I do think that the cutting of Jim Leighton, something that he said his assistant Archie Knox, a man almost as fearsome as Sir Alex, said he wouldn't have done. And I just think that, my memory of this game is just the complete panic whenever the ball went near Jim Leighton, and that Crystal Palace knew exactly where to put the ball, and that was near Jim Leighton.
Yeah, Joe, can I ask you, you described going to the game and all that. Was it easy to get tickets for an FA Cup final back then?
No, not at all. We used some... Okay.
Or should I not ask?
No, you can. No, it's absolutely fine. My father works in the airline industry, and the airline industry seems to be a rich source of tickets in those days, because people, if you work in the airline industry, a lot of people want to know you because they think they might get a free airline ticket out of you. And part of that relationship is, I think, getting tickets through. In fact, I was going to put this towards the end of the pod, but I will tell you that we did actually get tickets for the replay, which I couldn't go to for one reason or another. So the tickets were passed to two family friends of ours, Mick and Richard, and they went to it was on a Thursday, and whereas we'd sat right at the front, looking through the Wembley fence, had to stand on the seats for quite a lot of the game to actually see anything. They were actually in the Royal Box through this ticket connection, and they were sat next to Roy Hattersley, no less, and sat 2 rows in front of them was Jim Leighton.
There you go.
In his club suit, looking miserable as sin.
Yeah. Well, Jonathan, the first game in particular was obviously a very entertaining 3-3 draw. What do you remember of this game?
Well, I think there's sort of two key narratives come together at the end of this season. So there's obviously the Manchester United story that, famously the third round, the suspicion that Alex Ferguson would have been sacked had they lost to Nottingham Forest, and they get away with it, because he'd come in the autumn of '86, and they struggled. They come second, but they hadn't won a trophy, and at least under Ron Atkinson, for all the other problems, they had won the FA Cup in '83 and '85. So there's that sense of John talks about the panic, but the sense that United needed this for salvation. But I think there's actually something wider than that goes back to the semi-finals. And the two semi-finals, Crystal Palace beating Liverpool 4-3, United drawing 3-3 with Oldham and then winning the replay. Those two games, you could make a case for France v Switzerland and Spain Croatia in the year that's just finished. But I can't remember another day of two games in the same competition having the same drama, quality, excitement. And you got to put that in context that these were the first semi-finals since Hillsborough. It was a year after Hillsborough. It was the first time the FA Cup semi-finals had ever been on the same day. The FA felt it was against the spirit of the competition if teams in the second semi-final knew who they were going to play, which something we wouldn't even consider now. They're both televised, which has never happened before, and there was sort of a real doubt: can people cope with two football matches on the same day? So they put the EastEnders omnibus in between to try and break it up. But that day, I remember I'd come in from church. I missed about the first 5 minutes of Liverpool Palace, and that game was absolutely stunning. And I was supposed to go out if there's a football connection here, actually, Stevie Chalmers, who scored the winner for Celtic in the '67 European Cup final. His cousin David was married to a woman who was a good friend of my mum, and it was their what wedding would it have been? Silver wedding anniversary? Yeah, silver wedding. That day, and I was meant to be going with my parents to that, and I sort of dug my heels in to watch United be Oldham, and was warmly vindicated by a second sensational game.
Yeah. Well,
so the wider point being that had those been two terrible games of football, had there been further outbreaks of violence or some other terrible thing had happened, I don't know if football would have bounced back in the way that it did in the 90s. I think this was a very important couple of weeks in football's rebirth. And of course, you then have the World Cup, Italy 90, Gazza's tears, all that. But this is sort of the foundations for that.
Yeah. Yeah, I was going to say, this game cannot be considered without those two semi-finals. And we stayed over night before at some family friends in wonderful Slough, and got the train to Wembley. And what I remember was when we got onto the tube, Palace and United fans got on at the same time, and you begin to think, oh, hang on, this is still the era of sort of hooliganism, really. And there's a mass loving between the United and Palace fans because Palace had beaten the Scousers. And it was, and just this, and I believe it or not, I was quite small for my age, and I'm in this tube and the whole place is bouncing, but it was a celebration of beating Liverpool and the two teams being there.
But that's actually quite a key moment as well in terms of a shift of the balance of power.
Yes.
And I'm sure we'll do that Palace-Liverpool game at some point. So we won't go into too much detail. But the way Palace bombarded Liverpool and the way... Was it Hansen and Hussein, the two centre-backs?
Yes, it was, yeah.
Just could not handle it. And suddenly you saw this fragility in Liverpool, which you'd never seen before. And then, people moving away from a back four, the end of the back pass law, the introduction of the back pass law, so the end of having the back pass as a get out, Liverpool having to change how they played, Liverpool taking a long time emotionally, psychologically to come to terms with Hillsborough, not really reacting to the new financial circumstances. So, that day, at the semi-finals, although you would never have known it at sort of 6 p.m. that day, but it was a sort of key moment in Liverpool's, the beginning of their decline and the beginning of United's rise. Because if United had lost to Oldham, which they easily could have done,
yes,
they got away with it. Yet another Mark Hughes equaliser.
What a goal! Yeah.
They got away with it. Then would United have been the team to step into the breach? Maybe not.
Yeah. So ultimately, we've got to thank Alan Pardew for this sort of cataclysmic event in football.
Well, Alan Pardew's. I was about to say, we don't want to talk too much about the Palace semi-final. Alan Pardew's interview after that game is one of the least gracious interviews in victory you'll ever see.
Yeah.
He is incredibly annoyed at the temerity of any interviewer to ask him questions. You doubted us. Yes, Alan, you lost 9-0 to the same opponents earlier this season.
The team that went on to win the league fairly convincingly.
They put 11 goals past you without concession in 2 league games this season. There is a reason why you were not favourites for this game.
Well, sorry, John.
I was going to say actually, I wanted to talk about Palace actually and Steve Coppell, and obviously, unless you're a Crystal Palace fan, the narrative of this game is that it's Alex Ferguson's first trophy. But I do think Palace have forgotten what they actually achieved at that time, which was, I wouldn't say we're going to look back on it as like the highest point of English football, certainly on a club level. But Steve Coppell was only 34 at this time. He even had hair. And he constructed a team built in... It was something of a 1980s model. I think it probably owed something to the Graham Taylor, Howard Wilkinson model, of which I would suggest that Crystal Palace were probably the fittest team in the league around that time. Certainly the following season when they came third in the league. And also the ability to, you've got players who were journeyman professionals. If we're being slightly impolite about it, Gary O'Reilly had played for Tottenham and had dropped down to play for Palace. And you've got players like Jeff Thomas that have come up from lower leagues, from Crewe. And then you've got an unearthing of 2 strikers in Mark Bright and Ian Wright, who I'm sure we'll talk about later on. But this was a team that was very difficult to play against. Steve Coppell was one of the brightest young managers around, and you might say he perhaps didn't quite achieve what we might have expected at that point in his managerial career. This was probably the high point, certainly the following year. But I don't think if you speak to Palace fans of a certain generation, they would ask for any more from this team, because I do think that, my memories of meeting and hearing Palace fans that day, this was the greatest day in their lives too.
Well, they've still yet to win that major trophy, Crystal Palace, of course. We came mightily close in this final. But you're right, they were promoted. They finished 15th on 48 points. But Manchester United finished 13th, Jonathan, on 48 points. Seldom do we see an FA Cup final keenly contested between the 13th and the 15th position sides in the league.
Yeah, that I think is indicative of just how much United were struggling. So, Ferguson had taken over in '86. He'd inherited a squad that was pretty unfit, had a very unhealthy drinking culture, and it had taken him a long time to weed that out. So in this squad, little quiz for you, John. In this squad, one player remained who'd started Fergie's first game against Oxford. It was...
It wasn't Brian Robson, because he would have been injured. Because he would have been injured.
Would have been Neil Webb.
No.
I was just the first name that came to mind.
If I tell you he came off the bench in the first game?
Oh, Clayton
Blackmore.
Sunbed himself. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That tells you how huge the overhaul of players was. And of course, the 5 players had come in the summer of '89, and it's the Pallister, Ince, Phelan, Webb, Wallace, and some of those stories of Gary Pallister talking about basically being bored out of his mind, staying in so I've forgotten the name of the hotel in Manchester Piccadilly, the one that looks like an enormous concrete cash register. It became a Mercure.
Well,
I can't remember what it was back then.
It's called the Piccadilly Hotel, yeah.
Right, yeah.
George Best hangout of the 70s, yeah.
Yeah, and he basically had 2 hours a day training and spent the rest of his time there. So he spent the afternoons in the pub and the bookies because he had nothing else to do.
Yeah,
and he was eating fast food because he had no way cooking for himself and didn't want to sit in restaurants by himself. So again, just in terms of player welfare, of course, players took a long time to settle in.
Madness. Sorry, John, you were going
to... Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, like, actually, Jonathan makes a key point, which is that this was Ferguson's dig, ahead of this season, which started with a 4-1 win against Arsenal. United fans' hopes were very high because of the spending that had gone on. There was the Michael Knighton takeover that never was.
Well, again, that's astonishing. That's this season.
Yes. And there was an injection of cash, in which I think the club went into the red a little bit, and those 5 players that Jonathan mentioned, and all of them started. Now that Mick Phelan is a sort of permanently shorted part of the bench, it's difficult to recall that he was actually, and he played in this game as a sort of right winger. And then one player that I think is forgotten, sadly, because of what befell him. He suffers from multiple sclerosis these days. Danny Wallace. Now, when I was at this game, I was introduced. I've been to a reasonable amount of football at this time. I was reintroduced to the concept of the frustrating winger. Now, my memory of this game is that every time Danny Wallace got the ball, he would lose it. But actually, watching it back, Danny Wallace plays a key part in all 3 goals. The accusation was at the time that United had signed the wrong Wallace, because, of course, Rod went to Leeds and was a very good player for them. And it didn't work out for Danny Wallace. We know now the reason why he became seriously ill. And soon enough, United would be known for wingers with Lee Sharp, Ryan Giggs, Andrei Kanchelskis. But he played a key part in this game, and he's a sort of forgotten hero. He did a great job. He did a great job that, just like Mark Robbins in that 3rd round game, I think Danny Wallace went a considerable way to saving Alex Ferguson's job.
Yeah, and Neil Webb on the other wing. I mean, not a winger in any sense, but playing wide on the right with Phelan sort of going outside him.
Yes,
he plays a key part in 2 of the goals, and he was a player who very quickly fell out of favour. With his lack of pace and his injuries.
Neil Webb had snapped his Achilles tendon in an England game, the 0-0 against Sweden, the Terry Butcher game. You'll all remember that for the bleeding headband. And came back towards the end of that season, scored in the semi-final against Oldham. But I think it's fair to say, and I think Neil Webb would admit this himself, was never quite the same player. Because if you remember the player at Portsmouth and Nottingham Forest, he was a player that was often getting on the end of things. He had quite a decent goal record. By this point, he was deep lying, mostly because he couldn't run forward. And he unfortunately had problems with his fitness, problems with his weight, and never quite trained on. And, he is a sort of early casualty of that Fergie ruthlessness, which was, this guy's no use to me. And he went back to Forest a couple of years later. And funny enough, Neil Webb's wife at the time was in the media, Shelley Webb, and her and Sir Alex exchanged some words through the media at the time. So you have these players that are almost forgotten in the Ferguson story because of what followed later, but without them, there would have been no Ferguson story.
We should explain the Michael Knighton thing to people who don't
remember that
extraordinary incident.
And
so
those
Michael
who
Knighton,
don't know it won't believe it, I suppose. Yeah, far away, Jonathan.
The story gets weirder as it goes on. But he's a businessman who
had been an ex-player. I think that's
a semi-pro career or something.
A fledgling career. You know, one of these guys that I could have been a contender, but I had a bad knee injury. As one of those people. Yeah.
In 1976, he believed that while driving with his wife, he'd seen a UFO. He wants to buy United. That opening day against Arsenal that John mentioned, he's in the not just in the director's box. He's on the pitch before kickoff. Does some keepy-ups, lashes the ball into the net to great cheers. And then, I mean, his version of the story is that let me get this right, the Maxwell press turned on him. Other people suggest he's never had the available finance.
Yes.
But we're only actually talking about £10 million. I mean, obviously a huge amount of money to any normal person and even more back then. But in the context of modern football, it just seems like buttons. But he then ends up becoming owner of Carlisle, which is quite a step down from Manchester United, but which maybe suggests just what finance he did have available. They got promoted twice under him and relegated twice. Second of those relegations after he decided to take over as head coach. The very first job I had in football journalism, my first attempt to interview somebody was Michael Knighton.
Wow.
And I'd been out on the Lash one night. This is when I was still a student up at Durham doing my masters. And I was in bed at home when he rang, because no mobile phones. He rings the home phone. My mum answers the phone about 9:30 in the morning. And it's Michael Knighton on the phone for me to explain to a hungover me for half an hour why he doesn't want to do the interview. Which is I mean, literally the interview wouldn't have taken half an hour. So that was all very odd. But then do you know what became of him after Carlisle?
Go on.
He became a poet and a sculptor.
Yeah.
And he had a series of sculptures in 2006, a series of sculptures of the crucifixion, or maybe artworks, I think paintings of the crucifixion, exhibited at King's College, Cambridge, under the name Congthin Pearlmich, which is an anagram of Michael Knighton PR.
Fantastic. See, well, my only connection with Michael Knight was that I used to play for a team when I grew up in Edinburgh, and he was either the brother or the brother-in-law of the coach, and therefore we used to play in Carlisle United kits.
Wow.
Ah, nice.
There you are, you see. Good old Eddie Stobart. Anyway.
Everything connects.
Yeah, indeed. Ladies and gentlemen, we go for a quick break, and after that, we will talk about the match itself. See you in a moment. Welcome back to the Greatest Games on the Blizzard. So then, gentlemen, to Wembley for the match. Yes, so the semi-finals were brilliant, and then the final would live up to it, because often, John, the semi-final is better than the final. The final can be a bit of a cagey affair, but it wasn't to be this time.
No, and I think around this time, the FA Cup final sort of reached its apex. It was still very important, and there were some great games. The one the following year between Forest and Tottenham was also a great game. And then it started. And then actually, when Sunderland got in the FA Cup finals, things started going awry at that point.
Yes, that is important if they can get here.
Yeah. But yes, it started. I was actually listening back to the radio commentary of this game with Mike Ingham, Alan Green, and of course the legendary Jimmy Armfield, giving his unique insight. And Jimmy Armfield was the greatest of co-commentators, it has to be said, on radio.
And a lovely man. Genuinely lovely man.
Yes, absolutely. And he makes a very good point early on in the commentary, talking about the sort of star-studded midfield that we've discussed. Neil Webb, but Paul Ince was involved. I do think Paul Ince played fullback in this game. And Brian Robson. Brian Robson, of course, as was habitual, had a season wrecked by injury. And he's saying that United were producing nothing from midfield. Palace were going about their game pretty in the style that had won them the game against Liverpool, making it very difficult for United to play their game. And then, of course, Palace scored their first goal through future fighting talk pundit Gary O'Reilly. I used to find him quite funny on that, actually. And a ball in from, I'm going to say, forgotten man Phil Barber. It was something of a dummy run by Andy Gray, the other Andy Gray. And what a hit, son, by Phil Barber, who lobs it in, and of course, and here we have the first demonstration of the dissolution of James Leighton, in which he completely misreads it, flaps. Now, I watched the Ferguson documentary recently, the one that's just come out, made by his son, and they frequently refer to Jim Leighton as Big Jim. Now, they talk a lot about goalkeepers making themselves big. Now, Jim Leighton, I think, was probably about 5'11", 6 foot, looked about 5'2" during this game, and he flaps. Steve Bruce, it tries to hoof the ball away, ends up sort of hoofing it into the roof of the net. Utter chaos. And over in the United end, in this corner behind the fence, blind panic sets in. I was listening actually to Lee Martin, the hero of the replay, talking about how at that point United were used to conceding first in games and used to conceding from dead ball situations. So again, we should pay tribute to Steve Coppell, who, one of the good things about Crystal Palace in that era is that they were a very adept dead ball team. And in an era perhaps where coaching wasn't quite as rigorous, it was quite clear they worked through those scenarios particularly strongly.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not just... The thing that strikes me in retrospect as being really weird, it isn't so much how Leighton loses it in this game. You can see his mind just going.
Yes.
And I think there's obviously a seed there that he...
It'd been going for a while, Jonathan.
Yeah. But I think United must have seen how Palace... just destroyed Liverpool in that semi-final on set plays. So they must have focused on that. And I wonder if when you're starting to wobble, whether that then just makes you more nervous. But the thing that I find really odd is that Ferguson signed him in the first place because they didn't have
they didn't
a
get
particularly happy relationship at Aberdeen. That the famous, it's the 84 Scottish Cup final, or was it the 83 Scottish Cup final?
I think, yes. I think it might be
when Aberdeen beat Rangers in extra time with the Eric Black goal. And Ferguson's famous post-match rant, having won the game, about what a disgrace it is and how he didn't deserve to win it. But in 90 minutes, he goes up to Jim Leighton and goes, "You are Rangers' best player."
Well, yeah.
And then even worse, in 85, in the
Yes.
World Cup qualifier, when Jock Stein dies on the touchline, when that day, Jim Leighton loses a contact lens in the first half and daren't admit it because Fergie's in the dugout. And he daren't sort of admit that the he's lost his contact lens, hasn't brought any spares. So he's going around in this World Cup qualifier only able to see out of one eye. I mean,
it's madness. But I find it that Leighton's career was really interesting without getting too sidetracked, because this obviously had such an effect on him because from what you're saying. I mean, he was 31, maybe 32 by the time this cup final came around. And then for the next few years, Leighton's career, I think he went on loan and he was the odd appearance here and there. And you think, well, that's probably him winding down. And then, of course, he goes to Hibs and has a bit of a bit of an Indian summer and gets back into the Scottish national team and blah, 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 blah. But for those sort of years post this final, you could maybe argue.
I mean, the thing is, he obviously was a good keeper, because you
clearly
can't win the league title in Scotland in the early 80s and win the Cup Winners' Cup without being a decent keeper. But he's just one of those people. I guess maybe it's because of the generation we are. He looks like a goalkeeper from the previous generation.
Yeah.
That he's not a big physical... he's not a Schmeichel shape of goalkeeper.
Well, he always looked old as well, Jim Leighton.
Yeah, but he is the sort of the classic good shot stopper. In probably the last of that breed would be Shay Given or someone like that. In which I remember Jim Leighton making an unbelievable save from Alan McAnally when McAnally was playing for Aston Villa, and his reflexes were genuinely good. But I mean, it's quite odd to consider how often teams scored from crosses in that era. Yet Ferguson had a goalkeeper who really couldn't deal with a cross ball, and also considering that the two players playing in front of him were Gary Pallister and Steve Bruce, who, among their chief assets, you have to say, heading the ball, they were quite good at that.
Yeah, although they weren't the Bruce and Pallister they would become. I mean, Pallister particularly took a while to settle.
Absolutely.
And even this goal, I wouldn't say he's to blame for it, but he doesn't do great. I mean, the ball goes in off his sort of the back of his shoulder on neck, that O'Reilly's header hits him, and that's why it loops up, which makes it look worse for everybody. But it's not the most... And the which goal is it? Pallister's second goal, I think Pallister's quite badly at fault. But yes, I mean, both of them are, within a year or two, have become
supreme
famously
defenders.
impossible to beat in the air.
Well, and yeah, absolutely. Not that long after that first goal, of course, Manchester United had scored a goal of their own, and it was a cross and a header, and slightly scrappy. But Brian Robson went down on the score sheet, John, as getting that equaliser.
Yeah. Well, and this was. I suppose this was towards the end of the time that Brian Robson was the complete saviour of Manchester United, whenever he took to the field. And he had scored in the semi-final. Again, having not played for 3 months, this is Robbo. Patch him up, send him out there. He'll get you a goal. He will put his head in situations where people wouldn't put someone else's head, and just an incredible competitor. You have to, listen, those players that played with him, we'll often talk about Brian Robson being the best player they played alongside. And fans of a certain era, maybe a little bit older than me, will talk about Robson being the best midfielder that United ever had. And, I was certainly a huge admirer of him, but I do think, what came later with Roy Keane and so on probably superseded that. But he was such a player for the big occasion and the big goal and a sort of rabble-rousing way of pulling the team back into big occasions. Something maybe akin to Steven Gerrard, I think you'd probably say. But this header, again, Danny Wallace involved, and then the classic downward header that gives the goalkeeper something to worry about, not least because it comes off John Pemberton. And it looks a little awkward for Nigel Martin, but I don't think you can really blame him. And yes, of course, memories from the stadium, more bedlam. This was incredible. Of course, remember, we were stood on the seats, which were these sort of benches, essentially, and we all had to hang on for dear life.
So you were at that end of the ground or the other end?
I think we were at this end, yes. It's all a blur. It's all a blur. Yeah. I wasn't even drinking then, It was just...
I should hope not.
Everyone else was, but I was not. Maybe I had a nice mug of tea or something like that. But it was just absolute chaos. And, it was, Brian Robson had this sort of superhero status, even if he was patched up and barely able to run, and his refueling perhaps didn't assist his recovery in the way that we might expect these days. But what a player he was on occasions like this.
Yeah, Jonathan, I probably should have said before we start talking about the match, well, Manchester United expected to win this game. I sort of assume they are just because of the history and whatnot. But as I say, it was 13th versus 15th.
I think they probably were, but not in the same way they were in...
under Van Gaal?
Yeah, which year was that? 2017?
16.
16.
Yeah.
They would be favourites just because they were United. And they had won the Cup twice in the previous 7 years. They're clearly a bigger team. They clearly spent a lot more money on players. I think we talked about this a bit when we talked about the Arsenal-Luton League Cup final, which was the previous year, or was it? No, it was 88, wasn't it?
88,
yes.
88, where they finished very close in the table. But obviously Arsenal are big favourites because they're Arsenal and Luton are Luton. Well, here it is still United v Palace. So I think it still would have been regarded as a shock had Palace won. But people were very, very aware of United's vulnerabilities, and the fact that they, Palace wanted to win it. United needed to win it.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
So, if we can sort of jump forward perhaps to the second half, it's Mark Hughes who scores his first of the day, Manchester United second, and it's fair to say he liked the big occasion, John.
Oh yeah. I suppose we talk about Brian Robson as the the superhero, the warrior. Well, as he ebbed away, Mark Hughes became that player. Really, obviously he would score a perhaps even greater goal 4 years later in the semi-final against Oldham, and of course in the Cup Winners' Cup the following year as well. Mark Hughes, what was that phrase? A scorer of great goals, not a great goal scorer, was invented for him. That actually undersells what a good player Mark Hughes
is a touch harsh, isn't it?
Mark Hughes, he's okay, but by no means prolific. But he won the PFA Player of the Year award twice, and the reason for that was because no defender liked playing against Mark Hughes. Because I don't think in my near 40 years of watching football these days, there's ever been a more awkward customer playing up front, who also was an incredibly skillful player as well. the ball went up to him, it stuck, and his, let's put it, sizable rump and Chris Hoy style thighs, would hold off defenders, play the ball. He was more than a goal scorer, but he did score goals when it really mattered for United, and he was that heroic figure. And it's again something of a lost figure for United, and certain people maybe a bit younger than me might not recall Mark Hughes as such a hero because he left the club in '95 in disputed circumstances. Then he went to manage City, and he's often made it clear that he didn't really have much affection for United, and he certainly didn't have much affection for Sir Alex, with whom he had a difficult relationship. But I think in the retrospective, Sir Alex will always reflect on what an important player Mark Hughes was.
Yeah, I would say that perhaps they would shake hands and make up, but that sometimes causes problems with Mark.
Yes,
well,
indeed. Yeah,
but yes,
but I mean, he was he's sort of famous for his volleys, but he was just a great strike of a ball first time. So I mean, this is a slightly odd sort of scruffy goal. That it starts off quite neatly down the right with Neil Webb sort of doing a very, very slow sort of shuffle into the box.
Yeah, that was Neil Webb.
It sort of bobs about a bit, and then Andy Thorne goes to clear it and just smacks it straight into Neil Webb, and it deflects across goal. And there's Hughes at the back post, but the ball's spinning like anything, and somehow he slams it first time about a foot inside the post. It's an incredible finish.
Yeah.
I think that's it. When, as you say, you might have to wait a little bit for a Mark Hughes goal, although I don't want to undersell him, as you said, John. But it's usually worth the wait, I think. When
absolutely, yeah.
A brilliant Hughes is about to lace one. And it could Manchester United 2-1 up, and not long after that, Steve Coppell looks to his bench.
Yes,
and we know that that Brighton Wright formed a great partnership for Crystal Palace, which any Palace fan of a certain age will remember very, very affectionately. But Ian Wright comes off the bench and changes the fortunes for Crystal Palace in this game. Why did Wright not start?
He'd actually broken his leg twice that season.
It was injury, wasn't it?
Yeah. Hairline fractures of the tibia.
Yeah.
So I think he'd played 4 games. I think they say on the commentary he played 4 of the previous 22 games he could have done for Palace. But I wonder if, in a strange way, it did them a favour, because if you'd had Wright and Bright available, could you have played that 5-man midfield?
Yeah.
I'm not sure you would have done, because how can you leave one of them out? You can't. So obviously, you would rather have a fully fit Ian Wright there. But on the other hand, it did allow them to pack the centre of midfield, and that probably helped them in the long run. Then you could suddenly unleash him with 21 minutes to go. And the force, his impact when he comes on.
Oh, it's phenomenal.
Well, yeah, what you say, unleash, I can't think of a player more suited to that word, unleash, than Ian Wright. If you've left Ian Wright on the bench and he wants to prove something, particularly in a game like that, he's going to give it a good go, don't you? And I think actually at the time, people talk about this as Ian Wright's breakthrough, and of course, 2 goals in FA Cup final, of course it is. But his talent was known. I mean, for those of us who would listen to Sport on 2 coming back from matches or whatever, you would hear Wright and Bright regularly, would score for Palace, and you knew what a good combination they were. And unfortunately, that season in the first division was ruined by injury for Ian Wright, and yet he'd come up to the first division as their star man, and in fact, it'd more fallen to Mark Bright to score the goals for him. And then, he announced himself. And again, memories, suddenly he sets off. And as Jonathan said, Gary Pallister perhaps won't be too happy to look back on his...
Well, I'm not sure feeling will be either, because he just sort of brushes feeling off.
Yes.
And then a very sort of apparently straightforward jink inside, and there's Pallister on his arse. Yeah. And suddenly it's him against the...
up against water.
The
Jim
immaterial
Leighton.
Jim Leighton.
Yeah.
Poor old Jim. I mean, you can't really blame him for that one so much.
No, you can't, but I sort of... It's one of those occasions where, you have no doubt once Wright's in that position. There is no way Jim Leighton is saving that.
No. And everyone knew it. And the person that knew it the most, Jim Leighton.
Well, he had the best view. But I think with when Ian Wright gets the, as you say, and jinks inside, he creates that space. As you say, those who knew him knew the quality that he brought. He was chomping at the bit to get on, and it's just one of those inevitable things in football where you see and you just see the force of that inevitability bursting through, and you go, yeah, of course. And of course, when he scored, the celebration, that you're so pumped up, and suddenly it's 2-2 and all to play for. And no doubt your anxiety levels went up a fair few notches.
It was incredible, yeah. And the thing is, I suppose I'd sort of known what to expect with Ian Wright, and when that happened, yeah, and of course, United are staring into the abyss of an embarrassment, and of course they've got 10 men on the pitch, and the one that's missing is a goalkeeper. It's really, poor Jim, but that was the case, and it really, it just felt like a doomsday scenario, really. But extra time beckoned.
Well, we had Mike Phelan hitting the crossbar.
Yes, well, Mike Phelan actually was a master of hitting the crossbar, because at that time, I don't know if you recall this, his one and only appearance for England, I think, was in the build-up to the World Cup, and he actually hit the crossbar in that as well, and then was never granted an England shirt again. Now, I think that's possibly, when you consider the other midfielders England had at the time, that's possibly on merit, but, poor old Mike.
Yeah. And into extra time, and extra time wasn't very old, Jonathan, and Palace go 3-2 up, and it's that man Ian Wright again. Close range against poor old Jim.
Okay, close range is undersells it.
Yeah,
John Salako down by the corner flag pings a crossover, and it looks for all the world like he slightly overhit it, and suddenly Ian Wright lunges in, extends a right boot, and lashes into the roof of the net.
Yeah.
So it's an astonishing finish. And the only thing you'd say, I guess, from a Palace point of view, is they got it too early. They could have, they needed it either sort of 3 minutes earlier, so they were still in normal time, or they could have done with another quarter of an hour having passed, so you didn't have 28 minutes of United, hammering at them.
Yeah, it was from a Palace point of view, it's absolutely phenomenal. Again, Ian Wright, John, just it's that sort of power and sort of guile as well, because as Jonathan says, it was a great finish to sort of nip in there and do that.
Well, he read the flight of the ball, and I think we know who didn't. There will be some sympathy for Jim in a bit. Don't worry.
Yeah, but, I tried earlier.
Yeah, but
his autobiography's called "In the Firing Line."
There you go.
Oh no! But I mean, the thing is, I think the thing is, as I said, we became used to Ian Wright scoring those goals on a weekly basis. He was such a spectacular goal scorer.
Yeah.
I mean, who would you compare him to now? I think the player that I compare him to now is actually Jamie Vardy. Sort of similar.
Mm-hmm.
But similarly came into the game late as well, didn't he?
Yeah, but did similar,
that carefree attitude, not much respect for anybody in a good way.
Yeah, absolutely, and just will score spectacular goals, will take things on, believes in himself. Yep. Sometimes he might look like the touch isn't on, but he will still keep going and going and going. And I tell you what, when he did score goals, no one enjoyed themselves more than Ian Wright.
Yeah,
it was like a drug for him, wasn't it?
Absolutely. And Palace were 7 minutes away from winning that trophy, but it was that man Mark Hughes, John, who spared United blushes on the day.
Yeah. I mean, Mark Robins had come on, the usual saviour, but if you watch the game back, Mark Robins barely got a touch. Yes, Mark Hughes, a class finish this time, and that man Danny Wallace, the aforementioned, played the ball through. A couple of years later, by which time I graduated to actually being able to go to the game with my friends, there was a discussion. I was on the Stratford end. There was a discussion of Danny Wallace, and me and my mate were fairly dismissive of him. And let's put a refreshed gentleman turned to us and reminded us of how good Danny Wallace had been in that game, and that sort of, I suppose, always stuck with me. But yes, as he pointed out, he was the guy that played it through to Yuzi, as you have to call him, to equalise. And as you said before, Mark Hughes put in the position, great finisher, and that was pretty much it, really. And it was a feeling of relief. United did push on a little bit more, but I did feel that, and it felt actually at that point like a draw was a pretty fair result. I think that's fair to say.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing about that goal is it's a really good run from Hughes. Really good to outrun. But I don't know. It's a sort of run and goal. It seems to have died out of football now. But I guess it's because Wallace is sort of moving through a semi-vacant midfield, which you wouldn't, with pressing, you just don't really get, and that allows him to slow, which allows Hughes to make that run across his path, and then to
read the pass,
through to him. And so Hughes is sort of the angle of the finish is taking it back, across the angle of a run he's just made.
Yeah, it's quite an odd thing when you look back at FA Cup finals, they go to replays, because I don't think an audience nowadays would be in favour of that. Of course, it's been so long. But this goes to a replay, and again, like what is the atmosphere like when leaving the ground, John, after a 3-3 in a great game like that? I mean, you said beforehand there was a bit of a loving with Palace, and
I don't remember there being any. It was all pretty much, we'll see you on Thursday type of thing. It was all pretty convivial. We ran into a few people that we knew, and it was, oh well, we didn't lose. I mean, that was the point. I mean, when I got into school on the Monday, I was roundly mocked for the fact that my team had drawn 3-3 with Crystal Palace. I think that replicating a scene, I think that's in Nick Hornby's Fever Pitch, in fact. And then obviously we got our revenge on the Friday morning when Lee Martin did the business in the replay. But yeah, it felt like a fair result. And when I watched Match of the Day that night, trying to relive the occasion, it seemed like a fair result. And I remember years later, I actually had a story tape, which was Steve Bruce's The Making of Champions. And this was a regular companion of mine.
And had he written it?
No, it's well.
No Serbian war criminals or
no. It was before he became an acclaimed fiction writer. It was him just talking through the famous days. I think it cuts off the double in 1994, or maybe the title a year before, and it's him just talking through. And he makes a good point, which I think holds true, which is that the underdogs get one chance at a game, pretty much, and that's in the first game. And then in the second game, they don't get a chance. And I think that was pretty much the United view that, okay, we've learned about them, we will get the job done this time. And funny enough, if you recall the replay, Palace played in a totally different way almost. That they became very, very aggressive in that game. There was some. I mean, Les Seeley came in for Jim Leighton, as we should mention, and they decided they were going to dish out the treatment to, presumably, that they might have thought they were playing against Jim Leighton again, we're going to rough him up. But because it was Les, they decided to rough up Les. And the referee, Alan Gunn, I believe is his name, and that's how it's pronounced, it was... Alex Ferguson was not happy with his refereeing of the game. But anyway, Lee Martin got the job done. And if you recall that goal, my memory of the celebration when Lee Martin scores that goal, remember the celebration where the players all just lie on him in this sort of orgiastic scene of relief and celebration?
Well, it's a fantastic pass from Neil Webb.
It is fantastic.
I mean, a really good goal in a poor game.
Oh, it was an awful
good pass,
match.
Great finish.
Palace just did not show up again, did they?
But a great finish from a defender. I know it's a very, very cliche thing to say, but this was 1990. I mean, we were still really the vibe of the 80s were there. So a defender finishing like that was quite something. And
Lee Martin was, I suppose, the last remnant of the original Fergie's fledglings, which was a group of players that had come through essentially under Ron Atkinson's under the youth team and then made their way through. This is what often happens, isn't it? When a manager's having problems, one of the ways to offset the problems is to introduce quite a few young players and talk about the future. And I think that's what Ferguson did in those sort of dark months of 88 and 89. And by that point,
also as a way of sort of casting the blame back on Atkinson, because Atkinson pretty much never introduced a youth player.
No.
So it was Fergie's way of going, I'm doing it differently, but you will have to wait.
Yeah, well, the only one that he had introduced was of course, Mark Hughes, who had then been sold on. But yeah, and Lee Martin was, I suppose, the last of that breed. And then, as we know, they would be superseded by a distinctly superior generation. Could I spare a word for Jim Leighton?
Please do.
And I'm going to, but the view of this is from someone called Alex Ferguson, and about his dropping of Jim for the replay, which was, as I said, a lot of people have talked about that, including myself, about how this was a betrayal of someone he'd worked with and his ruthlessness. Sir Alex has never regretted that decision. We never expected he would do. But in his Managing My Life, the book that he wrote with the late Hugh McIlvanney, he says, the headlines next morning were varied, with the most severe accusing me of betraying Leighton. That allegation has hung in the air over the years. In a way, Leighton has been glorified. I think we know the way this is going. My view of the affair is very different. I have something to ask those who see Jim as a victim and me as a villain. If we had lost the cup final and I had lost my job, would Jim have felt guilty? Would he have apologised? I think the answer in both instances is no. To put it bluntly, I believe Jim was selfish.
Yeah, do you know what?
Wow.
When I was watching the highlights of this game back, that is the one thing that struck me, was that you selfish git, Leighton. How dare you? How bloody dare you? I mean, but by the way, we should say, of course, Jim Leighton MBE.
Yes.
So it didn't end badly. The Jim Leighton.
Well, yeah,
story.
It's a great redemption story. Yeah, it is. And
played for Scotland until
98 World Cup. Yeah,
he was there and played for Aberdeen until 2000. I think he retired when he was about 42, something like that.
No thanks to Alex Ferguson.
Absolutely zero thanks to Ferguson. Of course.
Two other things I think it's worth touching on. So one is United became the first team to win the FA Cup, having been drawn away in every round.
Yes.
Although in 1948, they'd also won the FA Cup without playing a game at Old Trafford, because Old Trafford was still suffered bomb damage, so they had to play games at Main Road and elsewhere. And I suppose we can make this a little quiz question.
Here we go.
But on the way to the Forest game, the third round game, and this puts in context just where United were at this stage, Fergie saw the bookmakers the price that United were to win the FA Cup that season and put some money on. And do you know what odds he got?
I reckon he probably got about 12 to 1.
25 to 1.
Well, I split the difference. 16 to 1.
Wow.
Imagine that. 16 to 1 to win United to win the FA Cup.
Yeah, for a trophy that United would be targeting as well.
Yeah.
Because the league was well done.
Twice in the previous 7 years.
Yeah.
Incredible. And it was Man United who were feeling glad all over at the end.
Oh, well done.
John, it's been a pleasure talking to you about these games, I suppose, but particularly the first one.
Yeah, really enjoyed it. Thank you, Marcus.
Nice one. Well, for more stories like that, do check out theblizzard.co.uk, everybody. But for myself and Jonathan, see you next time for another great game from the history of football.